This isn't in the books, but it should be. If you like what I do here, consider subscribing. Low light, open mind, silence within. March 11th, 2011. The date sits in history books now, sanitized, categorized, filed away as natural disaster, followed by nuclear incident. But the truth that unfolded that Friday afternoon in Japan was something darker, something that had been building in boardrooms and regulatory offices for decades before the Earth ever moved. Fukushima wasn't just destroyed by a tsunami, it was destroyed by decisions made in secret, by reports that stayed classified, by warnings that were silenced because listening would have been expensive. When the ground ruptured 18 miles below the Pacific, it didn't just trigger an earthquake. It triggered the collapse of every comfortable lie a nation had been told about safety, about preparation, about the people trusted to protect them. What followed wasn't just a disaster. It was an exposure. And what it exposed had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when nature would force the truth into the open, whether anyone was ready to see it or not. They didn't see it coming. Not the engineers, not the technicians monitoring the pressure gauges that Tuesday afternoon in March 2011. Inside the wounded reactors of Fukushima Daiichi, hydrogen was accumulating in the darkness, molecule by molecule, breath by breath. The cooling systems had collapsed hours before, leaving the fuel rods exposed like bones stripped bare. Water turned to steam. Steam tore hydrogen from metal, and the invisible gas rose into containment buildings never designed for such a guest. It wasn't loud, it wasn't visible. It was just there, waiting. A silent internal bomb with no timer, no warning light, no protocol in any manual thick enough to stop what was already written in chemistry itself. The truth about hydrogen is older than Fukushima. It's the first element on the periodic table, the most abundant substance in the universe, and under the right conditions, one of the most volatile. When zirconium fuel cladding meets superheated steam, the reaction is inevitable. Hydrogen peels away from oxygen, rising like a ghost through darkened corridors, filling voids that should have remained empty. In normal operations, venting systems would have released it safely into the sky. But nothing was normal anymore. The tsunami had erased every failsafe, every backup, every contingency plan written in boardrooms far from the coast. What remained was chemistry, physics, and time running out in a space no one could enter without dying. The engineers knew. They'd run the simulations, studied 3 Mile Island, read the reports classified and filed away in languages most of them couldn't read. Hydrogen accumulation wasn't theoretical. It wasn't some distant possibility debated in conference rooms over coffee and speculation. It was real, measurable, and happening in real time inside structures designed to contain radiation, not explosive gas. The build-up was silent because hydrogen doesn't announce itself. It doesn't hiss or glow or trigger alarms until it's already too late. And by the time anyone understood the scale of what was forming inside those buildings, the only question left wasn't if it would ignite. It was when. They tried venting, opening valves manually, by hand, in conditions that would have killed most people within minutes. The workers who went in knew what they were doing. They weren't heroes in the cinematic sense. They were technicians following procedures that had been hidden in binders marked emergency use only, procedures no one ever thought would be needed on Japanese soil. Some of those men are still alive, some aren't. The hydrogen didn't care either way. It kept building, kept rising, kept waiting for the smallest spark, the tiniest friction, the inevitable moment when pressure and chemistry would meet in a way that textbooks describe but no one wants to witness. Fukushima had become a ticking clock with no face. What they don't tell you in the news reports is how quiet it was before the explosion. No rumbling, no crescendo. Just silence, broken only by the hum of emergency generators and the distant sound of ocean waves still retreating from a coastline they just destroyed. Inside Unit 1, hydrogen filled the upper levels of the reactor building, invisible and patient. The people outside didn't know. The cameras didn't show it. It was a secret the building kept until it couldn't anymore. And when the spark finally came, the silence ended. But by then, the world had already started watching something far more visible than gas. They were watching what happens when a nation's faith in technology meets the unforgiving laws of nature. The reactors had become something else entirely, something no one had prepared for. The blast tore through Unit 1 at 3:36 p.m. on March 12th, and the world watched a superpower flinch. It wasn't the mushroom cloud of war, but the sharp, upward burst of industrial failure, concrete and steel panels lifting into the air like paper in wind. Japan, a nation that had built its modern identity on precision, efficiency and technological mastery, suddenly stood exposed. The explosion didn't just destroy a building, it shattered an illusion carefully maintained for decades. This was the country that gave the world bullet trains running on schedules measured in seconds, robotics that redefined manufacturing, and nuclear plants marketed as models of safety. But on that Saturday afternoon, hydrogen found a spark, and the carefully constructed narrative of invincibility collapsed in a single devastating moment captured by every camera pointed east. The footage spread faster than radiation ever could. News networks looped it endlessly. The internet dissected every frame. What people saw wasn't just an explosion. It was a crack in the foundation of trust between a nation and its institutions. For years, Tokyo Electric Power Company had assured the public that Fukushima Daiichi was designed to withstand anything nature could throw at it. Earthquakes, accounted for. Tsunamis, calculated. Core meltdown, impossible with modern safeguards. Except the truth had already been hidden in reports buried deep in corporate archives and government offices. Warnings about tsunami heights had been silenced. Engineering concerns about backup power placement had been erased from final assessments. The explosion didn't reveal fragility. It revealed what happens when economic pressure and political convenience outweigh scientific honesty. Other nations watched with a mix of horror and recognition. France, with its fleet of aging reactors along rivers that could run dry. The United States, with plants operating decades beyond their original licenses. Russia, still carrying the wound of Chernobyl in its collective memory. Suddenly, the classified documents and internal memos that nuclear authorities everywhere had kept sealed didn't seem so safely distant. Fukushima became a mirror. If Japan, with all its resources, discipline, and engineering prowess, couldn't prevent this, then what did that say about everyone else? The explosion forced uncomfortable questions into public discourse, questions that had been carefully managed and diplomatically avoided in international atomic energy meetings. Technology, it turned out, was only as strong as the honesty of the people operating it. The Japanese government's response in those first hours told its own story. Confusion. Contradictory statements. Evacuation orders expanded, then expanded again, then quietly expanded once more, as radiation readings climbed beyond what anyone wanted to admit on camera. The explosion had done more than damage a reactor building. It had blown apart the communication strategy, the crisis management playbook, the carefully rehearsed assurances that everything was under control. Officials used phrases like, no immediate danger, and within acceptable limits, while residents loaded children into cars and drove anywhere that felt safer than where they stood. Trust, once broken, doesn't return with press conferences, and the truth was still emerging from the wreckage, piece by contaminated piece. What made it worse was the silence that followed the noise. After the explosion, after the dust settled and the flames were extinguished, the real crisis was only beginning. 3 reactors were in meltdown. Spent fuel pools sat exposed to open air. Radiation levels were climbing in directions no sensor had been calibrated to measure accurately. But the explosion had become the image, the moment, the symbol of failure that would define everything to come. It wasn't the worst thing that happened at Fukushima, not even close. But it was the thing everyone saw, the moment the technological fragility of a global superpower stopped being theory and became undeniable reality. And in the days that followed, as engineers struggled to understand what was happening inside containment vessels they couldn't approach without dying, the world began to realize that the explosion was just the opening act. The real catastrophe was still unfolding, hidden behind twisted metal and rising steam. The wave didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like an ending. At 3:27 p.m., the Pacific drew back from the shore, pulling water away from Fukushima's coastline in a withdrawal that seemed almost deliberate. Fishermen who'd spent their lives reading the ocean knew what that silence meant. The sea was inhaling, and when it exhaled 14 minutes later, it came back with 46 feet of dark, churning water that moved inland like something with intent. This wasn't the first tsunami to hit Japan. It wouldn't be the last. But this one found Fukushima Daiichi waiting at the edge of the coast, built on assumptions that now seemed tragically optimistic. The engineers had calculated for a wave. They just hadn't calculated for this wave. The ocean had returned to claim what was built on borrowed time, and nothing in the plant's design could stop what was already in motion. The seawall stood at 19 feet, confident, permanent. A concrete promise that human engineering could hold back nature indefinitely. For decades, it had done exactly that, turning back smaller waves, routine tides, the predictable rhythms of a coast that had been inhabited for centuries. But the tsunami that came that Friday afternoon wasn't routine. It wasn't even exceptional by historical standards. Records buried in temple archives and geological surveys showed that waves of this height had struck the region before, centuries ago, leaving marks on cliffsides and stories in village histories that had been quietly erased from modern risk assessment. Someone had known. Someone always knows. But the truth about what the ocean could do had been filed away, classified under acceptable risk, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic confidence that mistook luck for invincibility. When the wave hit, it didn't crash. It simply rose over the seawall and kept going, swallowing the diesel generators that powered the backup cooling systems, flooding the electrical rooms that controlled the pumps, drowning the fail-safes that were supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Water poured into basements, shorted circuits, turned sophisticated machinery into expensive debris. The reactors, still generating decay heat from the fuel inside, suddenly found themselves cut off from the cooling systems they needed to survive. Engineers watched helplessly as gauges dropped to zero, as control rooms went dark, as the plant they'd operated for decades transformed into something unrecognizable. The ocean hadn't just damaged infrastructure. It had stripped away every layer of protection between the reactor cores and the atmosphere, leaving nothing but time and distance between containment and catastrophe. The approaching disaster had a speed limit. Meltdown doesn't happen instantly. It unfolds in stages, each one measurable, predictable, and utterly unstoppable once the cooling fails. Fuel rods heat up, water boils away, temperatures climb past the point where metal maintains its integrity. And all of this happens in darkness, behind containment walls thick enough to stop radiation, but not thick enough to hide what's happening inside. The workers who stayed knew what was coming. They'd trained for scenarios that always ended with cooling restored, power returned, crisis averted. But the ocean had rewritten those scenarios. The wave had turned theory into reality, and reality into something worse than any simulation had ever modeled. What was approaching wasn't just a meltdown. It was multiple meltdowns, happening simultaneously, in a facility that had never been designed to handle one, let alone three. The moment the ocean returned wasn't the moment of the earthquake. It wasn't even the moment of the wave itself. It was the moment when water met infrastructure and won, decisively and completely. Everything that came after, the explosions, the evacuations, the contamination that would spread across hundreds of miles, all of it traced back to those 14 minutes when the Pacific reclaimed the coastline and took with it every assumption about what was safe, what was possible, what could be controlled. The catastrophe wasn't approaching anymore. It had arrived. And the ocean, indifferent to human engineering and corporate assurances, simply kept moving inland, erasing towns, roads, and the illusion that anything built near its edge was ever truly permanent. Fukushima had been constructed to withstand nature. But nature, as it turned out, hadn't been consulted. Power died at 3:42 p.m., and with it, everything that made Fukushima Daiichi more than just concrete and uranium. The earthquake had severed the external grid. The tsunami had drowned the backup generators. What remained were batteries designed to last 8 hours, maybe 12 if they rationed every circuit, every gauge, every system that wasn't absolutely critical to keeping the cores from melting. But batteries don't replace rivers of electricity. They buy time. And time, in a nuclear facility losing cooling by the minute, is a currency that runs out faster than anyone wants to admit. The control rooms went dark except for emergency lighting that cast everything in red and shadow. Screens that had displayed temperatures, pressures, water levels, radiation readings, all the data that turns invisible processes into manageable numbers, went blank. Fukushima wasn't just losing power, it was losing sight, and a blind reactor is a reactor that can't be saved. The blackout was total in ways that transcended electricity. Engineers couldn't see inside the containment vessels. They couldn't measure coolant levels with precision. They couldn't verify whether the control rods had fully inserted, or if pockets of fission were still burning somewhere in the fuel assemblies. Every decision from that moment forward would be made on incomplete information, educated guesses, and the terrible knowledge that guessing wrong meant catastrophe. The instruments that remained functional told fragments of a story, pressure readings that climbed too high, temperature estimates based on calculations rather than sensors, radiation levels measured by handheld devices carried by workers who knew they were absorbing doses that would shorten their lives. The operation to save Fukushima became an operation conducted in darkness, both literal and informational, where the truth about what was happening inside those reactors remained hidden behind steel walls no one could penetrate without dying. Defenselessness has a particular quality in a nuclear crisis. It's not the defenselessness of surrender or retreat. It's the defenselessness of understanding exactly what needs to be done and lacking the means to do it. They needed water pumped into the reactor cores. They needed power to run the pumps. They needed cooling restored before the fuel melted through the containment vessels and into the ground below. But wanting these things and achieving them were separated by an ocean of seawater that had destroyed everything required to make them happen. The workers who remained, the skeleton crews that refused evacuation orders, they weren't heroes because they were brave. They were heroes because they understood the mathematics of meltdown and chose to stay anyway, knowing their presence might not change the outcome, but their absence would guarantee it. Mobile generators arrived, hauled across damaged roads by trucks navigating debris fields that had been towns just hours before. But connecting generators to a flooded electrical system isn't simple. It's not plug and play. It's tracing circuits through buildings too contaminated to enter, finding junction boxes underwater, improvising connections that were never designed to be improvised. Every hour that passed without cooling meant temperatures climbing higher, fuel assemblies degrading further, the invisible barrier between contained disaster and uncontained catastrophe growing thinner. The blackout wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a wound that kept bleeding, draining away options, narrowing possibilities, turning a facility designed with multiple redundancies into a place where single points of failure were all that remained. And those failures were cascading, one system offline triggering the next, until the entire operation balanced on improvisations that would have seemed reckless in any other context, but were the only choices left. The truth that no one wanted to say out loud was simple. Fukushima had become uncontrollable, not chaotic, not panicked, just beyond the reach of the people trying to save it. The atomic blackout had severed the link between intention and action, between knowing what needed to happen and having the power to make it happen. Radiation levels climbed in areas where workers needed to be. Equipment failed faster than replacements could arrive. Communication between the plant, Tokyo Electric headquarters, and government officials in Tokyo turned into a three-way confusion of conflicting information and delayed decisions. And through it all, the reactors kept heating, kept degrading, kept moving toward outcomes that everyone could calculate, but no one could prevent. The blackout had left Fukushima blind. But worse than that, it had left those watching from the outside blind too, staring at buildings they couldn't see inside, waiting for information that arrived too late, trying to understand a crisis that was already several steps ahead of every response. The darkness wasn't just in the control rooms, it was in the uncertainty itself. The seawall stood exactly as designed. 19 feet of reinforced concrete, engineered to specifications approved by experts, regulators, and corporate accountants who'd reviewed every meter of its construction. It wasn't a failure of craftsmanship. It wasn't poor quality materials or sloppy implementation. The wall did exactly what it was built to do. The problem was that it was built to stop a wave that Tokyo Electric Power Company had decided was the maximum credible threat. A phrase that sounds scientific, but is really just a calculation of acceptable risk dressed in technical language. Somewhere in the planning stages, in meetings where cost projections met safety margins, someone looked at historical data and decided that 19 feet was enough. They had access to older records, geological surveys, temple stones marking ancient floods that had reached much higher. But that information was quietly set aside, erased from consideration, because building a taller wall meant spending more money on a disaster that might never come. The decision wasn't made by one person. It never is. It was a consensus built across departments, regulatory agencies, government offices, all agreeing that the risk of a larger tsunami was acceptably low. The phrase appears repeatedly in documents that remained classified until after the wave had already hit. Acceptably low. As if risk could be negotiated with. As if nature respected cost-benefit analysis and engineering confidence. The truth buried in those archived reports was uncomfortable. Fukushima's coast had been struck by waves exceeding 40 feet in the past. Not theoretical past, documented past. The Jogan tsunami of 869 AD had inundated the region with water that travelled miles inland, a fact known to geologists, historians, and anyone who bothered to look beyond the convenient assumption that modern measurements captured the full range of what the ocean could do. But acknowledging that history meant acknowledging that the wall was inadequate, and acknowledging inadequacy meant spending money the company didn't want to spend. Cost-cutting in nuclear infrastructure doesn't announce itself. It hides behind optimized efficiency, streamlined operations, risk assessments that favor probability over possibility. The decision to build the seawall at 19 feet saved Tokyo Electric millions, maybe tens of millions. The exact figure is buried in budgets that have never been made fully public. But the savings were real, immediate, and easy to justify in boardrooms where quarterly earnings mattered more than century-scale disasters. No one wanted to believe the wave would come. Believing it meant acting on it, and acting on it meant costs that would show up on balance sheets, reduce profits, make the company less competitive in an energy market that rewarded efficiency above all else. So the wall was built to a height that satisfied regulations written by people who had the same incentives to minimize costs and maximize confidence. The system was working exactly as designed. That was the problem. When the 46-foot wave arrived, the 19-foot wall became irrelevant. The ocean simply rose above it and kept going, pouring into the plant with a volume and force that turned careful calculations into expensive rubble. The workers who watched it happen understood immediately what it meant. This wasn't a close call. This wasn't a near miss that could be spun in press releases as a triumph of preparedness. This was a complete failure of the assumptions that had shaped every safety decision for decades. The wave didn't just overtop the seawall. It exposed the hidden truth that safety had been subordinated to economics, that the decision about how high to build had never really been about protecting the plant or the people around it. It had been about protecting profit margins and maintaining the illusion that nuclear power could be operated cheaply and safely at the same time. The wound that decision left went deeper than the flooding. It poisoned trust in ways that would persist long after the water receded. Residents evacuated from the exclusion zone learned that their homes had been contaminated not by an unforeseeable act of nature, but by a foreseeable wave that corporate and government officials had chosen not to prepare for adequately. The word chosen matters. This wasn't ignorance. This was a choice made in full knowledge of the risks, a choice to save money in the short term at the expense of catastrophic consequences in the long term. And when the consequences came, when the reactors melted and entire communities were displaced permanently, the people responsible were already insulated by layers of bureaucracy, corporate structure, and legal language designed to ensure that no single individual could be held accountable for decisions that had been made collectively. The seawall stood at 19 feet, but the truth about why it was built that way remained hidden, silenced beneath layers of classified documents and carefully worded statements that avoided admission of what everyone already knew. Fukushima was flooded by the ocean, but it was destroyed by a decision made in a conference room years before the wave ever formed. It came from the horizon like a wall of everything the ocean had ever held back. Not white foam or cresting surf, but a dark mass of water carrying the weight of the Pacific itself, rising higher as it approached the shore, gathering debris, boats, pieces of coastal infrastructure into a churning front that moved with the inevitability of something that had been waiting centuries for this moment. The wave didn't break. It didn't crash in the way smaller waves do, spending their energy in a single violent moment. This one just kept coming. rising over the seawall as if it were a minor inconvenience, pouring into towns that had stood at the water's edge for generations. The coastline didn't resist. It couldn't. The force moving inland wasn't just water. It was displacement on a scale that turned geography into something temporary, negotiable, subject to revision by forces that human construction had never really contained, only temporarily held at bay. Fishermen saw it first from boats that had already been swept out to sea by the earthquake's initial displacement. From their perspective, riding swells in deeper water where the wave passed beneath them as a rise and fall rather than a wall. They watched their towns disappear under a surge that turned familiar streets into rivers, houses into floating debris, the entire coastline into an unrecognizable landscape of churning brown water. The truth of what they were witnessing wouldn't fully register until they returned hours later, if they returned at all, to find nothing where something had been. Entire neighborhoods erased, fishing fleets reduced to splinters. The wave devoured everything with an impartiality that felt almost deliberate, taking homes and schools and hospitals without distinction, leaving behind only the heaviest structures and the marks on buildings that survived, water stains showing how high the ocean had claimed before finally retreating. At Fukushima Daiichi, the wave arrived carrying pieces of the town it had already destroyed. Cars tumbled in the current. Boats rode the surge inland, smashing into buildings never designed to withstand maritime collision. The reactor complex, built to contain radiation and withstand earthquakes, suddenly found itself under assault from an element its designers had underestimated. Water-filled transformer yards, flooded turbine buildings, swept away fuel tanks and equipment that had been classified as protected, secured, safe from credible external threats. The operation to keep the reactors cool died in that moment, drowned in seawater contaminated with fuel oil, debris, and the dissolved remains of a coastline that had existed just minutes before. The wave didn't just damage infrastructure, it rewrote the parameters of what was happening, turning a nuclear plant into something caught between land and ocean, neither fully on solid ground nor fully submerged, but somewhere in a catastrophic middle state where nothing worked as designed. The sound of it was wrong. Not loud in the explosive sense, but loud in the way total transformation is loud, a roar of water and grinding debris that erased every other noise, every shout, every warning siren that had started wailing when the earthquake first hit. People running inland could hear it behind them, gaining, closing distance despite their panic. Some made it to higher ground, some didn't. The line between survival and erasure came down to seconds, to choices made in moments when thinking was impossible and instinct was the only guide. The wave didn't discriminate between the prepared and unprepared, between those who'd heeded warnings and those who'd stayed behind for one more minute, one more attempt to save something irreplaceable. It just took everything in its path and kept moving until the energy that had been transferred from the earthquake finally dissipated miles inland, leaving water where there should have been ground and silence, where there should have been communities. When it finally pulled back, retreating toward the ocean over the course of hours, it left behind a wound that would never fully close. The coastline had been devoured, yes, but more than that, it had been transformed. Nothing returned to where it had been. Nothing was recognizable. And in the wreckage, Fukushima Daiichi sat flooded, darkened, already deep into a crisis that would make the tsunami itself seem like just the opening act. The towering wave had done its work. It had exposed every hidden vulnerability, every cost-cutting decision, every optimistic assumption about what nature could and couldn't do. The ocean had risen from its basin. claimed what had been built at its edge, and then returned to wait, indifferent, while the consequences of its brief visit inland unfolded over days, weeks, years. The wave had passed, but what it left behind was just beginning to reveal itself, piece by contaminated piece, truth by silenced truth. Rikuzenta Kata disappeared in less than 3 minutes. A town of 23,000 people, reduced to foundation slabs and scattered wreckage before anyone could process what was happening. The wave didn't give time for goodbyes or second chances. It arrived with the speed of something that had crossed an ocean to get there, and when it hit, structures that had stood for decades simply ceased to exist in any meaningful form. Homes became kindling, schools became debris fields. The downtown district, with its shops and community centers and the ordinary infrastructure of daily life, was erased so completely that survivors returning days later couldn't identify where their own streets had been. The town hadn't just been damaged. It had been swallowed, consumed by water that left almost nothing behind except the occasional concrete foundation, and the truth that everything else had been drifting debris within seconds of the wave's arrival. The debris itself told stories no one wanted to read. Photographs floated in the water, faces of families now scattered or gone, pieces of furniture, still recognizable as chairs or tables, tumbled in currents that carried them miles from where they'd once sat in living rooms. Children's toys, school books, kitchen utensils, all the small artifacts of human life, mixed with shattered wood and twisted metal into a slurry that kept moving long after the initial surge had passed. The ocean didn't just take the towns, it redistributed them, spreading pieces across the landscape in a pattern that seemed almost deliberately cruel, placing remnants of one family's home in another family's flooded field, mixing communities into an unrecognizable mass where nothing could be traced back to its origin. The operation to recover anything meaningful from that chaos would take years, and even then, most of what was lost would remain lost, hidden somewhere in the sediment or carried out to sea on currents that had no memory and no obligation to return what they'd taken. Minami-Sanriku, Kasenuma, Onagawa, names that would become synonymous with erasure. Each town had its own geography, its own history, its own reasons for existing where it did along a coast that had always been beautiful and always been dangerous. But the wave classified them all the same way: expendable. The swallowing happened in stages, each one faster than thought. First the water hitting the outer buildings, those closest to shore, structures that had probably witnessed smaller tsunamis before and survived. They didn't survive this one. Then the wave pushing inland, momentum barely diminished by what it had already destroyed, hitting the next row of buildings, and the next, each one collapsing or being lifted off its foundation and carried forward as part of the surge. By the time the wave reached the center of these towns, it was carrying the wreckage of their edges, using destroyed buildings as battering rams against structures that might have otherwise withstood the water alone. The silence afterward was worse than the roar of the wave itself. When the water finally receded, what remained wasn't recognizable as towns. It was landscapes of debris, fields of shattered wood and concrete that stretched for miles, punctuated by the occasional building that had somehow survived, standing alone and damaged among the wreckage like a marker for what had been lost. Survivors walked through these ruins looking for anything familiar, any landmark that could orient them, tell them where they were standing relative to where they'd once lived. Most found nothing. The tsunami had hidden everything that mattered under layers of destruction that would take months to clear and decades to process emotionally. The towns had been swallowed. What came back up was something else entirely. a landscape that looked like the aftermath of war, but was really just the aftermath of water doing what water does when humans build too close to its edge and nature decides to remind them of the error. The drifting debris continued for weeks, spreading contamination and wreckage across regions that had been spared the initial wave. Fishing boats from coastal towns washed up miles inland. Cars floated in rice paddies. Entire houses, somehow still intact, settled in locations where they'd never been built, their contents scattered, but their structures holding together just enough to become monuments to displacement. Each piece of debris was evidence of a decision made years or decades earlier, a choice to build here instead of there, to trust this elevation or that construction method, to believe that proximity to the ocean was worth the risk because the risk seemed acceptably low. The wave had tested all those decisions simultaneously and found them wanting. The towns had been swallowed not because they were unlucky, but because they'd been built in the path of something that had always been inevitable, something the ocean had done before and would do again. The only question had been when. And on March 11th, 2011, when became now, and entire communities became drifting debris, reduced to fragments of what they'd been, scattered across a coastline that would never again look the way it had that morning. The fishing villages along Fukushima's coast hadn't been built recently. They were the product of generations, communities where family names went back centuries, where fishing techniques had been passed from father to son in an unbroken chain that predated modern Japan itself. The boats had names that meant something. The harbors had been improved and maintained by collective effort, each generation adding to what the previous one had built. Festivals marking the seasons, the catches, the relationship between land and sea. These weren't tourist attractions. They were living traditions, practiced continuously for longer than most nations had existed. And in the span of days following March 11th, all of it collapsed. Not gradually, not with time to adapt or preserve. Just gone, erased as thoroughly as if the centuries themselves had been rewound, leaving nothing but the knowledge that what had taken generations to build could be destroyed in less time than it took to understand what was being lost. The collapse wasn't just physical. Structures can be rebuilt, boats can be replaced. What couldn't be replaced was the continuity, the sense that the life being lived was connected to the life that had been lived before, stretching backward into history and forward into a future that looked similar enough to be recognizable. The tsunami severed that connection. Fishermen who survived found themselves in evacuation centers, separated from the water that had defined their existence, unable to fish even if they'd had boats, because the ocean was now contaminated, the catch potentially dangerous. The entire relationship between community and sea transformed from sustenance into threat. Young people who might have stayed, who might have continued the traditions despite the pull of cities and modern careers, they left. The operation to preserve what remained became an operation to document what was already lost. Anthropologists and historians arriving to record traditions from people who no longer had the context to practice them. The truth about tradition is that it requires continuity to survive. It needs practitioners, not just records. It needs communities, not just individuals remembering how things used to be done. Fukushima's coastal villages lost both in the same moment. The evacuation orders scattered families across Japan, breaking up communities that had been geographically stable for centuries. Children who would have learned fishing from their parents ended up in cities, attending schools where ocean skills meant nothing, where the knowledge that had been classified as essential for survival became trivia, interesting but impractical. The elderly, who held the deepest knowledge of tradition, found themselves in temporary housing, with no one to pass that knowledge to. Watching their world collapse, not in a single catastrophic moment, but in the slow realization that there was no next generation waiting to receive what they had. The festival stopped. Not officially cancelled, but simply not held, because the people who would have organized them were gone, displaced, scattered, or dead. The shrines remained, some of them, damaged but standing, empty of the communities that had maintained them. Spring came, and the seasonal celebrations that had marked the calendar for centuries didn't happen. Summer arrived without the maritime rituals that had blessed boats and prayed for safe returns. Fall and winter passed in evacuation centers where tradition meant nothing, and survival meant adapting to temporary circumstances that would stretch into years. The collapse wasn't loud. There were no explosions marking the end of cultural continuity. It just stopped, silenced by circumstances that made the old ways impossible and the future unrecognizable. What had been living tradition became memory, and memory without practice is just nostalgia, waiting to be forgotten entirely. Some tried to hold on. Fishermen who'd been evacuated inland started small operations teaching traditional techniques to anyone willing to learn, attempting to keep the knowledge alive even without the context that had given it meaning. Community centers in cities far from the coast hosted gatherings where displaced villagers could maintain some connection to each other, to the places they'd come from, to the lives they'd lived before the wave. But these were fragments, pieces of something larger that couldn't be reassembled because the foundation it had rested on was gone. The coast had changed. The water was contaminated. The exclusion zone had frozen entire communities in time, preserving structures but preventing anyone from living in them, creating ghost towns where tradition had once thrived. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, practice, identity, all of it collapsed in days, reduced to stories told by people who knew they were describing a world that no longer existed and likely never would again. The wave had taken the towns, but time was taking the traditions, erasing them more completely than any physical destruction ever could. It started 90 miles offshore, 18 miles below the ocean floor, in a place where no human had ever been, and no instrument could measure in real time what was happening. The Pacific Plate, moving westward at roughly 3 inches per year, had been pressing against the North American plate for millennia, accumulating stress in the locked boundary between them. Geology doesn't announce its intentions. It doesn't send warnings or preliminary signals that something catastrophic is building. It just stores energy, year after year, decade after decade, until the rock can't hold anymore and the plates slip. At 2:46 p.m. on March 11th, they slipped. Not gradually, all at once, a rupture extending nearly 300 miles along the fault line, releasing energy equivalent to hundreds of nuclear weapons, lifting the seafloor by 30 feet in some places, displacing billions of tons of water in a pulse that would radiate outward at the speed of a passenger jet. The trigger had been pulled by forces that operated on geological timescales, indifferent to everything human civilization had built above. No one could stop it, because no one saw it coming with enough clarity to matter. Japan had seismometers everywhere, early warning systems designed to detect the initial P waves of an earthquake and broadcast alerts before the more damaging S waves arrived. The system worked. It gave Tokyo 60 seconds of warning. It gave coastal communities even less. But warning isn't prevention. Knowing that an earthquake is happening doesn't stop the ground from shaking, or the plates from slipping, or the ocean from being displaced. The rupture beneath the Pacific was beyond human intervention in the most fundamental sense. It was a planetary process. Tectonic forces that had been building since before humans existed, finally releasing in a moment that lasted roughly 6 minutes, but would reshape the region for generations. The trigger was geological. The consequences were entirely human. The truth about earthquakes is that they're never truly unexpected. Seismologists had known for decades that the fault off Japan's coast was locked, that it was accumulating stress, that it would eventually rupture. Papers had been published, models had been created, risk assessments had classified the region as high probability for a major event. But knowing something will happen eventually is different from knowing when, and the when is what matters for preparation. The rupture happened during a Friday afternoon, during working hours, when schools were full and trains were running and nuclear plants were operating at standard capacity. Different timing might have meant different outcomes. A weekend, a holiday, the middle of the night when fewer people were commuting. But geology doesn't coordinate with human schedules. The plates slipped when the accumulated stress exceeded the friction holding them in place. And everything that followed was simply consequence cascading from that initial rupture, unstoppable and indifferent. The earthquake itself lasted 6 minutes, an eternity in seismic terms. Buildings in Tokyo swayed, cracked, but largely stood because Japanese construction codes had been written with earthquakes in mind, updated and improved after each major disaster. But Fukushima Daiichi wasn't in Tokyo. It was much closer to the epicenter, subjected to ground acceleration that exceeded design specifications, shaking that the plant had been built to withstand, but barely. The reactors automatically shut down, control rods inserting themselves the moment the seismic sensors detected movement exceeding safe thresholds. For a moment, it seemed like the system had worked. The operation to safely stop fission had succeeded. But stopping fission doesn't stop decay heat. The fuel rods would keep generating temperature for days, requiring continuous cooling. And the cooling systems, dependent on electricity from an external grid that had just been severed by the earthquake, were already running on backup power. The trigger had been pulled beneath the Pacific, but the bullet was still in flight, and its target was becoming clearer by the second. What made the rupture unique wasn't its magnitude, though 9.1 was exceptional. It was the combination of factors it set in motion. The earthquake damaged infrastructure. The displacement of the seafloor generated the tsunami. The tsunami destroyed the backup systems at Fukushima. Each consequence linked to the previous one in a chain that started 18 miles below the ocean and ended in meltdown, contamination, displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. The ground rupture was the trigger no one could stop. But everything that followed was shaped by human decisions, human infrastructure, human assumptions about what constituted adequate preparation. Nature provided the force. Humanity provided the vulnerabilities that force would exploit. And in the aftermath, when investigators picked through the wreckage looking for causes and failures, and moments where different choices might have meant different outcomes, they kept coming back to the same uncomfortable truth. The trigger was inevitable, but the catastrophe wasn't. It had been built over decades, brick by brick, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, until a single geological event could unravel it all in less time than it takes to understand what's happening. The plates had slipped, and everything hidden behind confidence and classification was about to be exposed. The shaking didn't arrive like waves on a shore. It came in pulses, violent and rhythmic, as if the earth itself had found a tempo that no structure could match or withstand. Buildings swayed in directions they weren't designed to move. Roads rippled like fabric. The ground, that most fundamental constant, the thing everyone assumes will remain stable beneath their feet, betrayed that assumption with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. Tokyo, 100 miles from the epicenter, felt the tremors as a long rolling motion that set skyscrapers dancing in their foundations, elevators lurching to emergency stops, windows flexing in their frames. But closer to the coast, near Fukushima, the shaking was something else entirely. It was percussive, sharp, a savage metronome beating out a rhythm that turned concrete into dust and certainty into terror. The frequency matched nothing in human experience. It was geological time compressed into seconds, millennia of accumulated stress releasing in a span that could be measured on a stopwatch but felt like it would never end. Inside Fukushima Daiichi, the shaking triggered every alarm simultaneously. Seismic sensors screamed their warnings. Control rods dropped into reactor cores with a speed that was both automatic and desperate, absorbing neutrons, stopping fission, beginning the shutdown sequence that should have meant safety. Workers grabbed whatever was bolted down, riding out tremors that threw unsecured equipment across rooms, shattered lights, turned familiar spaces into something from a nightmare. The plant had been designed for this. Earthquake-resistant construction, flexible piping, backup systems that would activate if the primary systems failed. But design specifications are written for earthquakes that engineers can imagine, and imagination has limits. The shaking that hit Fukushima that afternoon exceeded those limits in ways that wouldn't be fully understood until much later, when investigators could examine the damage without radiation forcing them back, when the truth about what the Earth had done to human infrastructure could be measured and classified and added to databases that would inform the next generation's mistakes. The rhythm of it was what stayed with people. Not random shaking, but something that felt structured, deliberate, as if the Earth was trying to communicate something in a language of force and frequency. Survivors described it as waves passing through solid ground, pulses that came and went but never fully stopped, aftershocks continuing for hours, days, weeks, each one a reminder that the initial rupture had left the region fundamentally unstable. The savage metronome kept ticking long after the main event, preventing rescue operations, collapsing structures that had survived the initial quake but couldn't withstand the accumulated stress of repeated shaking. Buildings that looked intact from the outside had been mortally wounded, their internal structures compromised in ways that wouldn't become apparent until days later when they suddenly collapsed under loads they should have been able to carry. The violence of the shaking had hidden consequences, wounds that wouldn't show immediately but were already fatal. At the nuclear plant, the shaking did more than trigger shutdowns and set off alarms. It cracked pipes. It damaged seals. It shifted components that had been aligned with precision, throwing off balances that would become critical when systems needed to work perfectly under emergency conditions. The operation to maintain reactor integrity had been compromised before anyone realized how badly. Leaks that should have been contained started spreading. Pressure relief systems that should have vented cleanly began releasing contaminated steam in directions that hadn't been planned for. The savage rhythm of the earthquake had played through every system in the facility, finding weaknesses that inspections had missed, exploiting tolerances that seemed adequate in theory, but failed under the kind of stress that only a major seismic event could generate. The shaking had been the first assault. The tsunami would be the second. But even before the water arrived, Fukushima had been wounded in ways that would make survival nearly impossible. The metronome finally stopped, or at least slowed to a rhythm that could be endured rather than merely survived. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of systems failing, of structures settling into new configurations, of people realizing that what they'd just experienced was only the beginning. The ground had stopped its violent shaking, but the consequences of that shaking were still unfolding. still cascading through infrastructure and institutions and communities that had been built on the assumption that the earth beneath them was stable, predictable, safe. The rhythm had been savage because it was honest. It had revealed the truth that everything solid is only temporarily so, that foundations can fail, that the order humans impose on the world is always one earthquake away from chaos. And in the minutes after the shaking stopped, as alarms continued to wail and workers began assessing damage, and the first reports of a tsunami started reaching control rooms, the metronome's message became clear. This wasn't over. It had barely begun. The sirens started within seconds of the initial rupture, automated systems responding to seismic data faster than any human could process what was happening. Across Japan, speakers mounted on poles and buildings came alive with warnings, electronic voices cutting through the ordinary noise of a Friday afternoon, telling people to seek shelter, to move away from windows, to brace for shaking that was already underway in some places and seconds away in others. The early warning system was one of Japan's technological achievements, a network designed to give people precious moments between detection and impact. It worked exactly as designed. Trains automatically braked. Elevators stopped at the nearest floor. Factory assembly lines shut down. Millions of people received the alert simultaneously. A cascade of warnings that should have meant preparedness, should have meant safety. But the sirens were screaming about an earthquake. They weren't screaming about what would come after. And no one, not the engineers monitoring the systems or the officials coordinating response, or the citizens following procedures they'd practiced since childhood, understood the real scale of what had just been set in motion 18 miles below the Pacific. The confusion wasn't immediate. At first, it seemed manageable. A major earthquake, yes, but Japan had survived major earthquakes before. Buildings swayed but held. Infrastructure remained mostly intact. Casualties from the shaking itself would be minimal compared to what the region had endured in previous disasters. The sirens did their job, and people responded the way they'd been trained to respond, taking cover, moving to safe spaces, waiting for the shaking to pass before resuming their lives. But then, the tsunami warning started, a different tone, a different urgency, and suddenly the scale began to shift. Coastal communities received alerts to evacuate to higher ground immediately. The word immediately doing heavy lifting in a context where immediately meant leaving everything behind, trusting that the warning was accurate, believing that the wave would be worse than the waves that had come before in living memory. Some people evacuated, some didn't. The sirens were screaming, but they couldn't convey the magnitude of what was racing toward the shore at jet speed. Tokyo Electric Power Company received the same warnings everyone else did, but they had additional information, classified data about what was happening inside Fukushima Daiichi. The reactors had shut down successfully. That was the good news. The external power grid had failed. That was concerning but manageable. Backup generators were running. Then reports started coming in about the tsunami, about wave heights that exceeded anything in the operational plans, about water moving inland faster than evacuation procedures could accommodate. The scale was becoming apparent, but slowly, piece by piece, each update revealing that the situation was worse than the previous update had indicated. Officials in the control room started making calls to headquarters in Tokyo, trying to explain what they were seeing, what the instruments were telling them. But language failed to capture the reality. How do you describe a wave that's erasing towns? How do you convey that backup systems are about to be destroyed when the people you're talking to are 100 miles away, looking at the same data but not feeling the ground shake or hearing the ocean approach? The real scale wouldn't be understood for hours, and by then it would be too late for understanding to matter. The sirens had screamed their warnings. The systems had functioned. But the gap between warning and comprehension, between knowing something bad was happening and understanding how bad, that gap was where the catastrophe found room to grow. News reports showed footage of the tsunami hitting coastal areas, dark water filled with debris, moving inland with unstoppable momentum. But the footage was fragments, individual cameras capturing individual moments, no single perspective showing the full scope of destruction stretching along hundreds of miles of coastline. Fukushima Daiichi was just one point on that coastline, one facility among thousands of structures being overwhelmed. The sirens couldn't have prepared anyone for this. They were designed for earthquakes and waves, not for the complete transformation of a region's geography and the beginning of a nuclear crisis that would make the natural disaster seem almost secondary. The screaming continued long after the initial warnings, aftershock alerts blending with tsunami warnings, blending with evacuation orders that kept expanding as radiation measurements started climbing. The sirens became a constant background, a soundtrack to catastrophe that people learned to ignore or internalize, because paying attention to every warning would have meant constant panic. But that first wave of alerts, those initial moments when the sirens started and no one yet understood what they were really warning about, that was when the illusion of preparedness collapsed. Japan had built systems to detect disasters. It had trained populations to respond. It had invested billions in infrastructure designed to withstand nature's worst. And all of it was functioning exactly as designed. The sirens were screaming. The warnings were accurate. The response was appropriate given the information available. But the real scale was hidden beneath the ocean, inside flooded reactor buildings, in the decisions that had been made years before about acceptable risks and adequate preparation. The sirens could scream all they wanted. They couldn't change what was already in motion, couldn't stop what had been set up to fail long before the first warning ever sounded. The realization didn't arrive as a single moment. It accumulated, piece by piece, as engineers in the control room watched gauges drop to zero, watched indicators go dark, watched systems that should have been redundant fail in sequence rather than providing the backup they'd promised. The earthquake had severed external power. Expected. The diesel generators had kicked in automatically. Also expected. But then reports started coming from workers near the turbine buildings. Voices on radios describing water, flooding, equipment submerged. The tsunami had reached areas that were supposed to be protected. And the generators, positioned in basements, because that's where they'd always been positioned, were drowning. Cooling pumps stopped. Water circulation ceased. And in that moment, as the engineers processed what the loss of cooling meant for reactors still generating decay heat, they realized they were in territory that existed in training manuals only as scenarios that ended with cooling restored or core damage prevented. There was no page for all cooling lost, no power available, tsunami damage preventing access. This wasn't a protocol. This was improvisation in the face of physics that wouldn't wait for solutions. The fuel inside the reactors didn't care about protocols or procedures, or the human scramble to restore systems. It just kept generating heat, temperatures climbing steadily, predictably, following curves that every nuclear engineer knows by heart. Without cooling, the water surrounding the fuel rods would boil away. Without water, the rods would heat past the point where their zirconium cladding maintained integrity. Without cladding, the fuel would begin to melt, slumping into configurations that could restart fission in uncontrolled ways, or simply melt through the reactor vessel into the containment structure below. Each stage had a timeline. Each timeline was measured in hours, not days. And every hour that passed without cooling, restored, meant moving closer to outcomes that had only happened once before, at Chernobyl, under circumstances that were supposed to be impossible in a modern facility with Western-style containment. But Chernobyl had been a scenario no one planned for either. And now Fukushima was becoming its own unique nightmare, operating off the edge of every map that emergency planning had drawn. The engineers started calling everyone. Tokyo Electric Headquarters, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, equipment suppliers who might have mobile pumps or generators, or anything that could move water into a reactor core. The conversations were surreal. Technical discussions about flow rates and pressure specifications happening while the ground continued shaking from aftershocks, and radiation alarms were going off in buildings that were supposed to remain clean. Someone suggested using fire trucks to pump seawater directly into the reactors. The idea was desperate, unprecedented, the kind of thing you do when every legitimate option has been exhausted. Seawater would destroy the reactors permanently, corroding everything it touched, contaminating systems that had cost billions to build. But destroyed was better than melted down. The truth that no one wanted to say was already obvious. These reactors weren't going to be saved. The question was whether they could be prevented from becoming something worse, whether the containment would hold, whether the crisis could be stopped at severe accident rather than escalating to radiological disaster affecting millions. There was no protocol for admitting to the public what was happening. The standard playbook said to maintain calm, provide measured updates, avoid panic. But what was happening inside those reactors was beyond measurement, beyond the sanitized language of press releases. Core damage was probable, meltdown was possible, hydrogen was building up in containment, raising the specter of explosions that could breach the structures designed to be impenetrable. And the engineers, the ones who understood the physics intimately, who could calculate exactly how bad this could get, they were being asked to explain it to officials who needed reassurance, to media who needed sound bites, to a public who deserved truth but might not be able to handle the unfiltered version. The failure wasn't just mechanical. It was communicative, institutional, a complete breakdown of the systems that were supposed to bridge the gap between technical reality and public understanding. The cooling had failed, but so had everything built around the assumption that cooling wouldn't fail, that redundancy meant safety, that scenarios this catastrophic were too unlikely to plan for in detail. In the control rooms, engineers kept working, trying solutions that were barely more than theories, operating equipment that wasn't designed for the conditions it was being subjected to, making decisions that would be analyzed and criticized for decades, but had to be made in minutes with incomplete information. They knew they were watching a catastrophe unfold in slow motion, knew that every passing hour without cooling made recovery less likely and consequences more severe. Some of them understood they might not survive this, that radiation exposure was climbing to levels that would have long-term health effects, that they were sacrificing their futures to prevent something even worse. The realization that there was no protocol for this didn't mean they stopped trying. It just meant they were writing the protocol as they went, creating new procedures in real time, learning what worked and what didn't through trial and error in circumstances where error could mean disaster. The cooling had failed, but the people trying to restore it hadn't, not yet. They kept working, kept improvising, kept hoping that somewhere in the physics and chemistry and engineering knowledge they'd accumulated over careers spent in nuclear power, there was a solution hidden that they just hadn't seen yet. The protocol didn't exist, so they'd have to invent one, and pray it worked before the fuel melted through everything designed to contain it. Inside the reactor vessel, temperatures climbed in darkness that no camera could penetrate, no sensor could measure directly, no human could approach without immediate death. The fuel assemblies, still arranged in their precise geometric patterns, began transforming from solid to something else. metal softening, cladding failing, uranium oxide pellets slumping downward under their own weight as temperatures exceeded 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't dramatic. There were no alarms specifically for fuel melting, because fuel melting wasn't supposed to happen, wasn't part of the design basis, wasn't something that modern reactors with their multiple redundancies and safety systems were supposed to experience. The core was heating up in silence, a silence made more terrible by the knowledge that it was happening at all, that somewhere behind 10-inch steel walls and concrete containment, the most dangerous materials humanity had learned to harness were beginning to escape their carefully engineered prison. The threat was invisible, untouchable, and growing with every minute that cooling remained offline. The silence wasn't complete. Radiation detectors in the reactor building were screaming, showing levels that indicated something catastrophic was occurring inside the containment. But the detectors couldn't show what, couldn't provide imagery or temperature readings or any of the data that would let engineers understand exactly how bad the situation had become. They were operating blind, making decisions based on physics calculations and assumptions about what should be happening given the conditions they knew existed. The core should be uncovered by now. The fuel should be melting. Hydrogen should be generating from the reaction between steam and zirconium cladding. All of this was predictable in theory, but theory and reality had stopped matching somewhere around the time the tsunami destroyed the last backup generator. What was actually happening inside that reactor vessel was hidden, classified by physics itself as unknowable to anyone outside the containment, a secret that steel and concrete were keeping even as the threat they contained grew exponentially. The workers who remained at the plant understood what an untouchable threat meant. They'd trained for radiation emergencies, practiced donning protective equipment, learned the procedures for evacuating contaminated areas. But this was beyond training. The radiation levels in some parts of the facility had climbed so high that protective equipment became almost irrelevant, exposure limits measured in minutes rather than hours, time enough to complete one critical task before the dose became life-threatening. They moved through the plant like ghosts, accomplishing what they could in the time they had, then retreating to areas where the radiation was merely dangerous instead of immediately lethal. The core heating up in silence was forcing decisions about who would go where, who would take what dose, who would be asked to sacrifice how much of their future health to prevent the present catastrophe from becoming something even worse. The threat couldn't be touched, but someone had to try anyway. The truth about nuclear fuel in meltdown is that it doesn't stop at the boundaries humans have drawn for it. The reactor vessel was designed to contain it, but only under normal operating conditions, only when temperatures remained within design specifications, only when the geometry stayed predictable and controllable. Once melting began, all those assumptions dissolved along with the fuel. The molten core could burn through the vessel bottom. It could react with concrete in the containment structure, generating gases and heat that would pressurize the building beyond its limits. It could find groundwater and create steam explosions that would scatter radioactive material across distances that would make evacuation zones seem optimistically small. Every scenario led somewhere worse, and the engineers calculating these possibilities knew they weren't being pessimistic, they were being realistic. The core was heating in silence because there was nothing left to stop it, no cooling water to absorb the heat, no system still functional that could alter the physics playing out in that darkened vessel. The silence extended beyond the reactor building, into the information void between what was happening and what could be communicated to the outside world. Government officials wanted updates. Media demanded information. The public deserved to know what threat they faced. But how do you explain that the core is melting when you can't prove it, can't show images, can't provide the kind of concrete evidence that people need to understand abstract dangers. The engineers at Fukushima were living with uncertainty that officials in Tokyo couldn't tolerate, trying to make policy decisions based on radiation readings and physics calculations rather than direct observation. The threat was real. It was growing. But it was untouchable in every sense, physically beyond reach, and informationally beyond verification. The nuclear core continued heating in its silent darkness, becoming something that existed between known disaster and unknown catastrophe, a wound in the facility that was spreading invisibly, threatening consequences that wouldn't be fully understood until long after the immediate crisis had passed. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of something terrible happening beyond human ability to witness or stop, physics taking its course while people scrambled to find any intervention that might matter, knowing that their window for effective action had already closed hours ago, when the cooling first failed and the protocol ran out, and the scenario shifted from manageable emergency to something that had no name because it wasn't supposed to exist. The orders came in stages, each one expanding the radius, each one displacing more people from homes they'd expected to return to within hours. First it was 2 kilometers, then 3, then 10, then 20. The progression told its own story, a narrative of officials realizing in real time that their initial assessments had been too optimistic, that the threat was larger and more persistent than anyone wanted to admit. Families loaded into cars with whatever they could grab in 15 minutes, leaving behind photo albums, heirlooms, pets, the accumulated possessions of entire lifetimes because the message was clear and urgent. Leave now, return later. Don't waste time deciding what matters. Except later kept getting pushed further into the future. And what had been described as a temporary precaution became a permanent displacement for tens of thousands of people who would never see their homes again. The evacuation turned cities into ghost zones faster than the tsunami had destroyed coastal towns, emptying streets not with water, but with fear of something invisible, something that sensors could detect but eyes couldn't see. Nami, Futaba, Okuma, Tomioka, names that became synonymous with abandonment. These weren't small villages. They were functioning municipalities with schools and hospitals and businesses, communities where people had lived for generations, raising families in the shadow of the nuclear plant that provided jobs and tax revenue and the promise of prosperity through technology. The evacuation erased all of that in hours. By the time the exclusion zone reached its final boundary at 30 kilometers, roughly 160,000 people had been displaced, scattered across Japan to evacuation centers, relatives' homes, temporary housing that would become permanent because the contamination wasn't temporary. The cities didn't collapse. They were just suddenly empty, streets still intact, but devoid of the human activity that had given them meaning. Traffic lights kept cycling through their patterns. Store shelves remained stocked. Rice cookers sat on kitchen counters with meals half prepared, abandoned when the evacuation orders came, frozen in time like archaeological sites preserving the moment everything stopped. The ghost zones weren't silent, not entirely. Wind moved through abandoned neighborhoods, rattling shutters, carrying leaves and debris into homes left unlocked in the rush to evacuate. Wild animals, emboldened by the absence of humans, began moving into the empty cities within days. Boars and raccoon dogs reclaiming territory that had been human for centuries. Nature didn't wait for permission. It just expanded into the vacuum, turning suburban streets into something that resembled wilderness more with each passing month. The operation to maintain these areas, to prevent looting or decay, or the complete surrender of human infrastructure to entropy, was impossible at scale. There weren't enough workers willing to enter the zones regularly. There wasn't enough equipment that could be contaminated and then disposed of properly. So the cities just sat there, frozen in March 2011, gradually deteriorating under the weight of abandonment and radiation that made everything inside the exclusion zone untouchable in the most literal sense. The suddenness of it was what traumatized people most. Not the evacuation itself, which could be understood as necessary given the circumstances, but the speed with which permanent life became impossible. One day you're living in a city, complaining about traffic or weather, or the ordinary frustrations of daily existence. The next day you're in an evacuation center 100 miles away, watching news reports about radiation levels in your neighborhood, realizing that the home you left expecting to return to within days will remain off limits for years, maybe decades, maybe forever. The psychological wound of that displacement would take longer to measure than the radiation itself, manifesting in depression rates, suicide rates, the slow erosion of community bonds that had been maintained across generations but couldn't survive geographic scattering. The ghost zones weren't just empty cities. They were evidence of how quickly modern life could be erased, how fragile the infrastructure of daily existence was when the foundation it rested on turned out to be contaminated. The evacuation turned cities into museums of abandonment, preserved by radiation rather than intention, off limits to everyone except the occasional researcher or government official conducting surveys in protective equipment. Photographers who entered the zones illegally brought back images that looked post-apocalyptic, not because of visible destruction, but because of the absence of people, the eerie preservation of spaces designed for human habitation but containing none. Classrooms with lesson plans still written on blackboards, shops with merchandise displayed for customers who would never come, homes with family photos on walls, looking out at rooms that would slowly decay without anyone to maintain them. The sudden transformation from living city to ghost zone happened so fast that the physical evidence of life remained perfectly intact, even as the life itself was scattered across Japan, displaced by something that left no visible mark but made return impossible. The cities stood as silent testimony to what had been lost, not to the tsunami or earthquake, but to the hidden failure of a nuclear facility that had promised safety and delivered contamination that would outlast anyone alive to remember when these streets were full of people living ordinary lives, unaware that beneath the normality was a threat that could erase everything in the time it took to issue an evacuation order. The rain came 3 days after the explosions, falling soft and steady across the exclusion zone, across fields that should have been preparing for spring planting, across rooftops that no longer sheltered anyone. It looked like ordinary rain, clear droplets catching light the way rain always does, forming puddles that reflected sky and clouds as if nothing had changed. But the Geiger counters told a different story, clicking faster as the water accumulated, measuring cesium-137 and iodine-131 that had been lofted into the atmosphere by the hydrogen blasts and now returned to Earth, dissolved in precipitation. The rain wasn't just water anymore. It was a delivery mechanism, spreading contamination across landscapes that the explosions themselves hadn't reached, carrying radioactive particles into soil, streams, reservoirs, the entire hydrological system of a region that had already been wounded by tsunami and earthquake. The emptiness made it worse somehow. Rain falling on rooftops no one would repair, soaking into fields no one would harvest, nature continuing its cycles indifferent to the contamination it was now distributing across the countryside. The abandoned fields took it worst. Rice paddies that had been cultivated for generations absorbed the radioactive rain, concentrating cesium in soil where roots would take it up, where it would enter the food chain if anyone tried to grow crops here again. The contamination was invisible, undetectable without instruments, but permanent on timescales that made human lifetimes seem brief. Cesium-137 has a half-life of 30 years, meaning that even after 3 decades, only half of what fell that week would have decayed. The rest would remain, bound to soil particles, moving slowly through the environment, rendering agricultural land useless, not through visible destruction, but through molecular-level poisoning that no amount of decontamination could fully reverse. The farmers who'd worked these fields, who'd known every irrigation channel and understood the soil chemistry in ways that came from generations of accumulated knowledge. They watched from evacuation centers as weather reports showed rain falling on land they could no longer touch, destroying livelihoods in slow motion. The rooftops collected it in gutters designed to channel water away from foundations into drainage systems that now carried contamination toward rivers, toward the ocean, dispersing what had been concentrated in the reactor cores across watersheds that fed communities far beyond the exclusion zone. The operation to track this spread, to measure contamination levels in every stream and aquifer, was overwhelmed before it started. There weren't enough inspectors. There weren't enough instruments. The rain kept falling, and every storm became an event that spread the contamination further, diluting it but also expanding the affected area, creating zones where radiation levels were too low to trigger evacuation, but too high for safety, grey areas where people had to decide for themselves whether staying was worth the... The truth about radioactive rain is that it doesn't respect boundaries, doesn't stop at evacuation zone perimeters, doesn't limit itself to areas that have been classified as contaminated. It just falls wherever weather patterns take it, indiscriminate and invisible. The emptiness amplified the tragedy. If people had still been living in these areas, if the evacuation hadn't already happened, the rain would have been a crisis requiring immediate response, iodine tablets distributed, shelter-in-place orders issued, emergency protocols activated. But the areas most affected were already abandoned, ghost zones where radioactive rain fell on empty streets and accumulated in gutters that would never be cleaned. The contamination happened without witnesses, without the immediate human cost that makes disasters comprehensible to people watching from afar. It was just rain falling on emptiness, making that emptiness permanent, ensuring that even if radiation levels eventually dropped to acceptable ranges, the psychological wound of knowing what had fallen here would prevent return. Who wants to live under rooftops that collected radioactive rain? Who wants to grow food in fields that absorbed cesium from explosions they watched on television? The contamination was physical, but the wound it left was deeper than molecular. The rain eventually stopped, weather patterns shifting, carrying contamination in new directions, diluting what had been concentrated until measurements became difficult and officials could start talking about acceptable levels and safe return. But the fields remained abandoned. The rooftops kept collecting ordinary rain that fell on homes no one would inhabit. The exclusion zone expanded and contracted based on measurements and policies. But the areas where radioactive rain had fallen heaviest would remain off limits long after anyone could remember what it felt like when these landscapes were alive with human activity. The rain had fallen silently, without the drama of explosions or the visible destruction of tsunamis. Just water doing what water does, carrying whatever it finds back to Earth. But what it carried this time was evidence that the contamination from Fukushima wasn't contained, wasn't limited to the plant itself, had spread across a region in ways that would take decades to fully understand and longer than that to remediate. The rain fell on emptiness and made that emptiness permanent, one quiet storm at a time, washing radiation into soil that would hold it for generations, into water that would carry it far beyond any boundary humans tried to draw around the disaster. The boundaries appeared on maps as clean lines, circles radiating outward from Fukushima Daiichi at distances calculated by radiation measurements and political compromise. 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers. Zones marked in colors that corresponded to contamination levels, red for the highest readings, orange for elevated, yellow for monitored. But the lines on maps didn't translate cleanly to the ground, where roads that had connected communities for decades suddenly ended at checkpoints manned by police in protective equipment, where barricades blocked access to entire municipalities that remained physically intact but legally forbidden. The restricted land didn't look restricted from a distance. Trees still grew, buildings still stood, rivers still flowed through valleys that had been inhabited for centuries. But time had stopped there in March 2011, sealed away by contamination that made return impossible and demolition dangerous, creating a landscape frozen between past and future, accessible only to those with permits and dosimeters, off limits to everyone who'd once called it home. The sealing happened gradually, then all at once. First came the evacuation orders, temporary in phrasing but permanent in effect. Then came the checkpoints, barriers that started as temporary measures but became permanent infrastructure, staffed around the clock to prevent unauthorized entry into zones where radiation exposure could accumulate to dangerous levels within hours. Then came the longer-term plans, the discussions about decontamination that revealed how thoroughly the land had been compromised, topsoil that would need to be stripped and stored somewhere, buildings that would need to be demolished because their materials had absorbed cesium that wouldn't decay for decades, forests that couldn't be decontaminated at all and would remain sources of contamination for generations. The operation to restore these areas was discussed in meetings in Tokyo, but the people who'd lived there understood what the officials wouldn't say directly. The land wasn't being prepared for return. It was being sealed away, sacrificed to prevent contamination from spreading further, written off as the price of the disaster. Entire ecosystems now existed behind those boundaries, cut off from human interaction in ways that created accidental nature, preserves more absolute than any protected by environmental law. Wild boars multiplied in abandoned towns, their population exploding without hunters to control them. Birds nested in buildings that would have been maintained if anyone could have lived there. Plant species that had been controlled or cultivated reverted to wild states, gardens becoming forests, rice paddies becoming wetlands, the human-managed landscape transforming into something else under the pressure of abandonment and time. Scientists who entered the zones on research permits documented changes that happened faster than anyone expected, nature reclaiming space with a speed that suggested it had only been waiting for humans to leave. The sealed land became a laboratory for studying what happens when human presence is removed suddenly and completely, not by choice, but by contamination that made coexistence impossible. The truth hidden in those kilometers of restricted land was more than radiological. It was economic, social, cultural. Property values collapsed for land that couldn't be accessed. Tax bases evaporated for municipalities that existed on maps but contained no residents. Schools closed permanently, their students scattered across Japan, never to return to the communities where they'd expected to grow up. The sealing of the land was also the erasing of futures, possibilities that had existed before March 11th, but stopped existing after, timelines that split when the evacuation orders came and never converged again. Young people who might have stayed, who might have inherited farms or businesses, or the responsibility of maintaining family graves, they moved on, built lives elsewhere, let go of connections to places they could no longer visit. The land was sealed, But so were the futures that had been tied to it, locked behind barriers that wouldn't come down in any timeline that mattered to the people displaced. The restricted zones didn't just seal away land. They sealed away evidence, turning the areas closest to the plant into crime scenes that couldn't be processed, because approaching them meant lethal radiation exposure, leaving questions about exactly what happened in those first hours and days unanswered, because the answers were behind barriers that would remain in place for decades. Investigators could model what occurred. They could analyze data from sensors that survived. But they couldn't walk through the facilities, couldn't examine equipment directly, couldn't verify their conclusions against physical evidence that remained inaccessible behind restrictions measured in millisieverts per hour. The sealed land kept its secrets, not through conspiracy or classification, but through simple physics that made proximity deadly and investigation impossible. Time stopped there in ways that went beyond the frozen evacuation scenes in abandoned homes. It stopped in the sense that the investigation couldn't move forward, that understanding couldn't advance beyond what could be gleaned from a distance, that the full truth about what contaminated these kilometers would remain partially hidden until radiation decayed enough to permit entry. And by then, other evidence would have degraded, disappeared, become part of a landscape that time was transforming in ways that erased as much as it preserved. The land was sealed. The truth was sealed with it. And both would remain that way longer than anyone alive could wait. The water had to go somewhere. That was the terrible arithmetic that emerged once the immediate crisis stabilized into something chronic. Once it became clear that cooling the melted fuel would require continuous water flow, and that water, once it touched the cores, became too contaminated to store indefinitely. At first they used tanks, massive steel containers erected hastily across the plant site, holding hundreds of tons of radioactive water, while engineers tried to figure out more permanent solutions. But the tanks kept filling. Every day brought more contaminated water, groundwater seeping into damaged reactor buildings, rain falling on exposed structures, cooling water that couldn't be recycled, accumulating faster than storage could expand. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of tons. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands of liters of water contaminated with strontium, cesium, tritium, the entire periodic table of fission products now dissolved in a liquid that had nowhere to go except, eventually, into the ocean that had started this catastrophe in the first place. The Pacific didn't ask for this burden. It had already been contaminated in the immediate aftermath, when cooling water pumped directly into reactors flowed out through cracks in the containment and into the harbor, when radioactive steam vented from buildings settled on the ocean's surface, when debris from the tsunami carried contamination back into the water it had come from. But those were acute releases, intense but limited. What came later was worse because it was deliberate, controlled releases of treated water that still contained radioactivity, diluted to levels that regulators classified as acceptable, but which accumulated in an ocean that already carried the burden of nuclear testing, industrial pollution, and now Fukushima's ongoing contribution to Pacific contamination. The truth that officials wouldn't state directly was simple. There was no solution that didn't involve the ocean absorbing what the land couldn't hold. Storage had limits. Treatment had limits. Physics didn't care about public perception, or fishing industry concerns, or international outcry. The contaminated water had to go somewhere, and somewhere was the Pacific. The operation to treat the water before release was presented as a technological triumph. Filtration systems that could remove most radioactive isotopes, reducing contamination to levels that met regulatory standards, making the release technically legal, even if morally complicated. But most wasn't all. Tritium couldn't be removed, bound to water molecules in ways that made separation impossible with available technology. Some cesium remained, some strontium. The treated water was cleaner than the untreated, yes, but clean is relative when you're discussing radioactive contamination that will persist in the ocean for decades, migrating through currents, accumulating in marine life, eventually finding its way into food chains that humans depend on. The ocean was absorbing millions of liters, diluting it across volumes that made concentration seem negligible. But negligible, multiplied by millions of liters and measured over decades, wasn't negligible anymore. It was a chronic, low-level contamination event that would be studied by oceanographers and marine biologists for generations, trying to understand what it meant for Pacific ecosystems that were already stressed by warming, acidification, and overfishing. Fishermen in the region understood what the releases meant, even if the official statements tried to minimize concerns. Markets collapsed for fish caught anywhere near Fukushima. Consumers refused to buy seafood from the Pacific, not because testing showed dangerous contamination levels, but because the trust had been erased by years of conflicting statements and revelations about problems that had been hidden or downplayed. The ocean was absorbing the contaminated water, but coastal communities were absorbing the economic consequences. Livelihoods destroyed not by radiation itself, but by the perception of contamination that made their products unsellable. The wound was economic and cultural. Fishing traditions that had survived tsunamis and wars collapsing under the weight of something invisible that sensors could barely detect. But public fear amplified into existential threat. The ocean could absorb millions of liters, but the communities that depended on that ocean couldn't absorb the loss of trust that came with knowing those liters carried contamination from melted reactor cores. The releases continued because stopping wasn't an option. The melted fuel still needed cooling. The groundwater still seeped into damaged buildings. The rain still fell on exposed structures. Every day brought more contaminated water that had to be treated, stored, or released, and storage had already reached capacity multiple times, requiring expansion that couldn't keep pace with accumulation. So the water flowed into the Pacific, treated and diluted and measured and reported in press releases that emphasized safety, while admitting continued releases that would persist for decades. The ocean absorbed it all with the same indifference it had shown when generating the tsunami, currents carrying contamination away from Fukushima, dispersing it across areas so vast that concentration became theoretically insignificant, but present nonetheless, traceable in measurements that would mark this disaster in Pacific water chemistry for longer than anyone involved would be alive. The ocean had begun this catastrophe by returning to claim the coastline. Now it was ending it, or at least making it chronic, by absorbing what the land couldn't hold, taking into itself millions of liters of evidence that the disaster wasn't over, wasn't contained, was just being diluted into something that could be classified as manageable, even if the word manageable had lost all meaning in the context of radioactive contamination that would outlast nations. The boats remained tied to docks in harbours that were still functional, still intact, protected by breakwaters that had somehow withstood the tsunami's force, even as the towns behind them were destroyed. But the boats didn't leave. Not because of damage, though many had been lost or needed repairs. They didn't leave because the ocean itself had been transformed from provider to threat, from the source of livelihood that had sustained these communities for generations into something contaminated, suspect, legally questionable. Fishermen who'd learned their trade from fathers who'd learned from their fathers, knowledge passed down through centuries about currents, seasons, the behavior of species that migrated through these waters. All of it became suddenly irrelevant. The tradition wasn't just threatened, it was over. Radiation doesn't care about fishing techniques or accumulated wisdom or the cultural significance of communities built entirely around maritime harvest. It just contaminates. And contamination, even in low levels, even in measurements that scientists insisted were safe, destroyed markets faster than any tsunami could have destroyed boats. The collapse happened before anyone was ready to acknowledge it. First came the official restrictions, fishing banned within certain distances of Fukushima, zones that expanded as contamination measurements revealed wider spread than initial models had predicted. Then came the market collapse, buyers refusing seafood from the entire region, regardless of whether it came from restricted areas or not. The perception of contamination mattering more than actual measurements. Then came the cultural disintegration. Young people who'd been uncertain about continuing family traditions, making the decision easy by leaving entirely, moving to cities where their backgrounds as fishermen's children became curiosities rather than useful skills. The tradition collapsed in days, but its death played out over years as fleets sat unused, expertise atrophied from lack of practice, and the infrastructure that had supported fishing communities, the processing facilities and ice houses and auction markets, slowly shut down from lack of business. What had survived centuries of natural disasters couldn't survive radiation, couldn't outlast contamination, that made the product of generations unacceptable to consumers who would never see Geiger counters, but would always remember the images of Fukushima burning. The truth these communities learned was brutal. Tradition requires continuity, and continuity requires economics, and economics requires trust. All three were severed by contaminated water being released into the Pacific, by radiation measurements showing cesium in fish caught far from the exclusion zone, by media coverage that amplified every detection into a crisis even when levels were below regulatory limits. Fishermen could prove their catch was safe. They could show testing results, documentation, certifications from authorities who confirmed contamination levels were negligible. But proof didn't matter when perception had already destroyed the market. Restaurants didn't want to explain to customers why Pacific seafood was actually safe despite Fukushima. Distributors didn't want the liability. Consumers didn't want the worry. So the fish went unsold, catches dumped or destroyed, boats returning from trips that wouldn't cover fuel costs, let alone support families that had been supporting themselves from ocean harvest since before modern Japan existed. The hidden wound went deeper than economics. These weren't just jobs that disappeared. They were identities, entire self-concepts built around being fishermen in communities where that meant something, where that connected you to history and landscape and a way of life that had proved resilient across centuries of change. The collapse erased that in a time frame that gave no one a chance to adapt, no transition period where old ways could be honored while new ways were learned. It was simply over, finished, ended by contamination that most people in these communities would never be exposed to directly, but which destroyed their livelihoods as thoroughly as if the radiation had poisoned them personally. Young fishermen in their 20s and 30s, men who'd expected to continue family traditions for another generation at least, found themselves retraining for jobs on land, leaving communities that were emptying, watching their elders age out of an industry that would die with them because there would be no one coming after to continue the work. The boats stayed tied to the docks, weathering, degrading, becoming symbols of abandonment more visible than the contamination that had caused it. Some communities tried to preserve the traditions in modified forms, tourism-focused fishing trips that let visitors experience the techniques even if commercial fishing was economically impossible. Others gave up entirely, accepted that the collapse was permanent, let the boats rot and the docks decay, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries fade into memory. The tradition hadn't just collapsed in days. It had been erased, replaced by nothing, because nothing else made sense in these coastal communities where the ocean had been everything, and now the ocean was tainted, legally accessible, but economically poisoned by contamination that would persist in public perception long after it had decayed to undetectable levels in actual fish. The communities were watching their own death in slow motion, understanding that even if they survived as geographic locations, they would never again be fishing villages in any meaningful sense. The tradition was gone. What remained was just people living near water they could no longer trust, practicing skills they could no longer profit from, maintaining identities that no longer connected to viable futures. The investigators arrived with credentials from the International Atomic Energy Agency, technical experts from countries with their own nuclear fleets, engineers who'd spent careers studying reactor safety and failure modes. They came expecting to document an unprecedented natural disaster overwhelming a well-designed facility, a tragedy of circumstance rather than negligence. What they found instead was a pattern of hidden warnings, risk assessments that had been filed and ignored, structural vulnerabilities that had been identified years before the tsunami and classified as acceptable rather than addressed. The failures weren't sudden. They'd been developing for decades, documented in reports that Tokyo Electric Power Company had submitted to regulators who'd accepted them without demanding changes, both parties operating under the shared assumption that probability was low enough to justify inaction. The international monitors discovered what some people inside had always known. Fukushima wasn't destroyed by an unforeseeable disaster. It was destroyed by foreseeable risks that had been acknowledged, calculated, and deliberately left unmitigated because mitigation was expensive and catastrophe seemed unlikely enough to gamble on. The seawall was the most obvious example, but it wasn't the only one. The backup generators positioned in basements that would flood in any significant tsunami. The emergency cooling systems that depended on electrical infrastructure vulnerable to the same events that would make cooling critical. The containment vents that could create hydrogen buildup in reactor buildings if used during an emergency. Every vulnerability had been noted in some document, some assessment, some engineer's memo that got filed away after management decided the risk was acceptable or the modification too costly. The truth was buried in archives that the investigation slowly excavated, document by document, revelation by revelation. The structural failures weren't discoveries to everyone. They were discoveries to the public, to international observers, to regulatory bodies outside Japan that had assumed Western-style reactors operated to standards that prevented exactly the kind of cascading failure that had occurred. But the people who'd worked at Fukushima, who'd raised concerns in meetings that went nowhere, who'd watched decisions being made that prioritized economics over safety margins, they weren't discovering anything. They were finally being vindicated. Their warnings proved catastrophically correct in ways they'd never wanted to be right about. The monitor's reports started circulating, heavily technical documents that were eventually summarized in language accessible to non-engineers, and the summaries were damning. System after system showed design decisions that appeared adequate under normal circumstances, but failed under the exact conditions that would make them critical. Redundancy that wasn't actually redundant, because all backup systems shared vulnerabilities to common failure modes. Safety margins calculated to minimums that left no room for conditions exceeding design basis, even though exceeding design basis was exactly what major disasters did. The structural failures were systemic, woven into the facility's fundamental architecture in ways that would have required complete redesign to fix, costs that would have been prohibitive, questions that would have challenged the entire economic model of nuclear power in Japan. So the failures remained, known internally but hidden from public disclosure, classified under operational security, or dismissed as acceptable risk until the day they weren't acceptable anymore, until they became catastrophic. The operation to hide these failures hadn't been a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something more mundane and more insidious, a bureaucratic process where inconvenient information was acknowledged in ways that prevented anyone from being directly responsible for ignoring it. Engineers documented concerns, managers acknowledged them in reports, regulators reviewed the reports and approved operations. At each stage, responsibility was diffused, accountability distributed across so many people and institutions that no single point of failure could be identified. The structural failures were known internally, yes, but known in a way that prevented action, known within a system designed to transform knowledge into inaction, concerns into paperwork, warnings into archive entries that would only be reviewed after catastrophe made them relevant. The international monitors discovered this system along with the failures it had perpetuated, understood that what happened at Fukushima wasn't unique to Japan or that particular facility, was actually representative of how nuclear power had been operated globally, safety subordinated to economics within regulatory frameworks that enabled exactly that subordination. The discoveries kept coming, each investigation layer revealing more problems, more warnings that had been silenced or erased from decision-making processes. Seismic data showing potential for larger earthquakes than design specifications accounted for. Historical records of tsunamis exceeding the heights the seawall was built to withstand. Engineering studies recommending modifications that would have prevented the hydrogen explosions. All of it was there, documented, filed, available to anyone who looked. But looking required assuming that the people operating the facility might be wrong, might be cutting corners, might be prioritizing profit over safety. And that assumption wasn't one that regulators were incentivized to make, wasn't one that fit within the collaborative relationship between industry and government that characterized nuclear oversight in Japan. The structural failures had been long known internally. What the international monitors discovered was the system that had made that knowledge irrelevant, the processes that had transformed warnings into acceptable risks, the institutional architecture that had guaranteed catastrophe eventually, even as everyone involved believed they were operating safely. The failures were structural, but so was the inability to address them. And that structural inability, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and shared assumptions, was still operating in facilities around the world, still classifying risks as acceptable, still filing warnings that wouldn't be acted on until after the next disaster made them undeniable. The reports existed years before the wave hit, bound documents stored in corporate archives and government offices, technical assessments that had calculated tsunami heights using historical data, geological surveys, and computer models that should have revealed the danger. They did reveal it. That was the problem. The numbers in those secret reports showed potential for waves exceeding 40 feet, scenarios where the existing seawall would be overtopped, where backup generators would be flooded, where the entire cooling system would fail in exactly the sequence that later occurred. But the reports carried a classification that kept them from public scrutiny, marked as internal assessments, proprietary analysis, information that Tokyo Electric Power Company wasn't required to share with communities living in the shadow of the plant. The underestimation wasn't ignorance. It was a choice, a deliberate decision to use more optimistic models for public-facing safety assessments, while the more realistic projections remained hidden in files that wouldn't be opened until investigators came looking for explanations after the catastrophe had already happened. The truth buried in those pages was uncomfortable on multiple levels. Engineers at Tokyo Electric had access to the Jogan tsunami research, geological evidence showing that a massive wave had struck the region in 869 AD, inundating areas well beyond what modern risk assessments considered credible. They'd reviewed the data, incorporated it into some models, then set it aside in favor of analyses that showed lower probability, smaller waves, risks that fell within design specifications that had already been built and paid for. The decision wasn't made by one person. It was a consensus reached across departments, management and engineering and regulatory affairs, all agreeing that the geological record was too ancient to outweigh modern measurements, that thousand-year events could be classified as beyond design basis, that building for worst-case scenarios identified by historical data would make nuclear power economically unviable. The secret reports showed the real risks. The public reports showed the acceptable version, and the gap between them was where the disaster found room to grow. Other facilities had made similar calculations, not just in Japan but globally, operating nuclear plants in coastal areas where tsunami risk was acknowledged but underestimated, where seawalls were built to heights that satisfied regulations but wouldn't satisfy the ocean when it decided to exceed those calculations. The secret reports from Fukushima, once they became public in the investigation's aftermath, triggered reviews at other plants, belated examinations of whether the same optimistic assumptions had been made elsewhere, whether other communities were living near facilities protected by engineering confidence rather than engineering reality. Some plants upgraded, some didn't. The pattern repeated, risk assessments showing problems, management deciding the probability was low enough to defer action, information classified in ways that prevented public pressure from forcing changes that economics made undesirable. The Fukushima reports weren't unique. They were representative of an industry-wide approach to safety that prioritized plausibility over precaution, that treated historical events as statistical outliers rather than warnings. The operation to keep these reports secret hadn't required elaborate conspiracy, just the normal functioning of corporate and regulatory structures that classified technical documents as proprietary, that treated safety assessments as business information rather than public interest data, that operated under frameworks where companies were trusted to self-report risks and regulators were expected to accept those self-reports, absent evidence of deliberate falsification. The secret wasn't that Tokyo Electric had lied. It was that they'd told different versions of the truth to different audiences, using the most optimistic, credible analysis for external communication, while maintaining more realistic assessments internally for their own planning. Both sets of documents could be defended as technically accurate, just based on different assumptions, different models, different weightings of historical versus modern data. But only one set of documents showed the risks that actually materialized, and that set had been kept secret, hidden not through active deception, but through passive non-disclosure, information that existed but wasn't shared because sharing it would have required admitting that the facility was more vulnerable than public statements suggested. When the reports finally became public, forced into the open by investigations that had legal authority to access corporate archives, the underestimation was undeniable. The risks had been known. The potential for catastrophic failure had been calculated. The scenarios that played out in March 2011 had been described in documents written years earlier, predicted with enough accuracy that the only real surprise was that anyone who'd read those reports had allowed operations to continue without modifications. But the reports had been secret, classified, hidden from the communities whose futures depended on the accuracy of tsunami risk assessment, silenced within a system that rewarded optimism and punished expensive precaution. The wave that destroyed Fukushima had been predicted, just not publicly, just not in documents that could have been used to demand changes, just not in ways that would have forced the uncomfortable admission that nuclear power as currently operated required accepting risks that, if fully understood, might have been unacceptable to the people being asked to live with them. The secret reports showed the truth. But secrets, by definition, don't influence decisions made by people who aren't allowed to know them. And by the time the secrets stopped being secret, the underestimation had already cost thousands of people their homes, their communities, their faith that the institutions responsible for protecting them had ever actually prioritized protection over profit. Vines appeared first, creeping through cracks in foundations, climbing walls that no one would paint again, finding purchase on surfaces that would have been maintained if anyone could have stayed. Within months of the evacuation, the abandoned towns began their transformation, not through dramatic collapse, but through the gradual assertion of plant life that had always been waiting at the edges of human settlement. Gardens that had been carefully tended went wild, ornamental species mixing with invasive ones, creating ecosystems that existed nowhere else because they'd been shaped by abandonment rather than design. The decay was slow because the structures themselves remained sound. Buildings that would have lasted decades with basic maintenance, but now stood empty, windows intact but filled with vegetation, roofs collecting leaves and debris that would eventually compromise their integrity. Nature didn't destroy these towns. It just reclaimed them, one season at a time, erasing human presence with a patience that made the process feel almost deliberate. The animals understood before the plants did. Wild boars moved into neighborhoods within weeks, finding no resistance, no hunting pressure, no humans to challenge their expansion into territory that had been residential for generations. Their population exploded in the absence of control, herds moving through streets that still bore the painted lines and signage of human traffic patterns, rooting through yards, denning in abandoned buildings where they'd never been able to access before. Raccoon dogs followed. Foxes, species that had coexisted with humans at the margins, now occupied the center, making homes in structures built for entirely different purposes. The ecology shifted faster than anyone studying it had predicted. Radiation levels that should have been inhibitory, apparently less important than the absence of human interference, creating an accidental experiment in what happens when a modern landscape is suddenly returned to wild management without the gradual transition that conservation usually requires. The truth about decay is that it reveals what was always temporary about human settlement, how much of what seems permanent is actually maintained through constant effort that stops being visible until it stops happening. Roads cracked without repair, frost-heaving pavement that wouldn't be resurfaced, vegetation pushing through from below. Utility poles leaned as their foundations eroded, power lines they'd supported long since disconnected, but the structures themselves still standing in slowly increasing angles. Rust spread across metal surfaces that would have been painted. Wood rot advanced through structures that would have been treated. Each season brought visible change. The abandoned towns looking less like empty cities and more like archaeological sites. Evidence of human habitation gradually being erased by processes that operate on different timescales than human maintenance cycles. The decay was slow, but it was inexorable, and watching it through photographs taken by researchers on periodic visits, the transformation was stark, the same locations becoming less recognizable year by year. The operation to preserve anything in these zones was impossible at scale. Radiation made regular maintenance dangerous. Economics made it pointless, preserving structures that no one could use, that would remain off limits for decades, even if perfectly maintained. So the towns decayed, museums of abandonment changing in real time, teaching lessons about impermanence that no one had wanted to learn this way. Families who'd evacuated saw photographs of their former homes, gardens they'd planted now unrecognizable, structures they'd maintained now slowly succumbing to weather and neglect, and the simple absence of human care. The decay was personal for them in ways it couldn't be for researchers documenting ecological succession or urban planners studying what happens to infrastructure without maintenance. These were memories being erased, childhoods being overgrown, material evidence of lives that had been lived in places that were becoming something else entirely, neither ruins in the dramatic sense nor functional structures, just buildings in transition from human use to whatever comes after. Nature's overtaking wasn't violent. It was gentle, almost respectful, vines covering rather than destroying, animals inhabiting rather than demolishing, the slow decay preserving structures, even as it transformed them. But gentle didn't mean reversible. Each year of abandonment made eventual return more difficult, decontamination more expensive, restoration more complicated by the need to address not just radiation, but the accumulated effects of time and weather and biological processes that had claimed these spaces. The towns were decaying in slow motion, visible evidence that contamination's effects extended beyond radiation measurements, that the wound Fukushima had opened included time itself, the years lost to abandonment that could never be recovered, even if radiation levels eventually dropped to acceptable ranges. The slow decay was its own disaster, separate from the nuclear crisis but connected to it, playing out across landscapes that had been vibrant communities and were becoming something no one had words for yet. Not quite wilderness, but no longer human. Abandoned towns in transition to a future that would bear almost no resemblance to their past. The wound doesn't show in photographs. It's not visible in radiation maps or evacuation zones or the statistics that measure contamination and displacement. It exists in the space between what Japan was before March 11th and what it became after, a rupture in national identity that can't be quantified, but is felt across generations, across regions that weren't directly affected by the tsunami or the meltdowns. Japan had built its modern self-image around technological mastery, around the idea that disasters could be managed through engineering and preparation, that the nation's vulnerability to earthquakes and typhoons had been transformed into resilience through infrastructure and planning. Fukushima shattered that narrative not because it happened, but because it revealed that the preparations were inadequate, that the technology could fail catastrophically, that the institutions tasked with safety had prioritized other concerns. The cultural wound is the gap between the Japan people thought they lived in and the Japan that actually existed, hidden beneath confidence until disaster made the truth undeniable. Trust dissolved in ways that will take generations to rebuild, if it rebuilds at all. Trust in government, which had assured populations that nuclear power was safe, even as internal reports showed otherwise. Trust in corporations, which had cut costs and hidden risks, while marketing themselves as responsible operators. Trust in experts, who'd either failed to see the vulnerabilities or had seen them and remained silent. The wound isn't anger, though anger was certainly present in the immediate aftermath. It's something deeper and more persistent, a fundamental uncertainty about whether institutions can be believed, whether official statements correspond to actual conditions, whether the people in authority are operating in the public interest or in service of other priorities that just happen to align with public interest when convenient. This kind of doubt doesn't heal with press conferences or compensation payments. It persists invisibly, shaping decisions people make about where to live, whether to have children, how to interpret information from sources that used to be trusted by default. The persistence of the wound shows in demographic patterns that won't fully manifest for decades. Young people leaving regions near Fukushima, not just from the exclusion zone, but from areas that were never evacuated, never officially contaminated, never declared unsafe, but which carry the psychological weight of proximity to disaster. Birth rates declining further in a country already facing population collapse, the disaster adding another reason to defer or avoid parenthood, another source of anxiety about futures that seem more uncertain than the past. Economic decisions made with the implicit understanding that catastrophic failure is possible, that preparation may be inadequate, that the next disaster might reveal new hidden vulnerabilities that experts assured everyone didn't exist. The cultural wound manifests in patterns of behavior that seem individually rational, but collectively accelerate trends that were already concerning before the tsunami. Japan's demographic and economic challenges deepened by a disaster that wasn't supposed to happen, and then did anyway, confirming fears that had been dismissed as pessimistic. The operation to heal this wound requires more than decontamination, or compensation, or even criminal prosecution of those responsible, though all of those have been attempted with varying degrees of success. It requires rebuilding the fundamental assumption that institutions can be trusted to operate in good faith, that expertise means competence rather than just confidence, that the people making decisions about acceptable risk are actually considering public welfare rather than corporate balance sheets. But how do you rebuild that trust when the disaster itself revealed it was misplaced? When the documents that eventually became public showed that concerns had been raised and ignored, that risks had been known and accepted without public input, that the catastrophe was foreseeable to people who had access to information that was deliberately kept from those who would bear the consequences. The wound persists because the conditions that created it haven't fundamentally changed, because plants still operate under similar regulatory frameworks because the gap between public assurance and private risk assessment remains. Japan carries the wound invisibly because there's no other way to carry it. No visible marker that distinguishes people affected by institutional betrayal from those who weren't. No obvious symptom that lets outsiders identify the damage. It shows in conversations about the disaster, in the careful language people use when discussing nuclear power, in the implicit understanding that official statements require interpretation, translation from what's being said to what's actually meant. It shows in the persistent uncertainty about food safety, consumers still checking labels for origin, even when testing shows no contamination, the perception of risk outlasting the measurable presence of radiation. It shows in the communities that were evacuated and told they could return, only to find that return was theoretically possible but practically unbearable, living in places marked by what happened there, unable to forget or move on or pretend that normal life is possible in the shadow of permanent disaster. The wound is cultural because it's shared, collective, a transformation in how an entire nation understands its relationship to technology, risk, and the institutions that mediate between them. And it's persistent because healing would require addressing not just the consequences of this disaster, but the systemic failures that enabled it, changes that remain incomplete, questions that remain unanswered, accountability that remains diffused across too many people and institutions to be meaningfully assigned. The wound doesn't show, but everyone knows it's there. And that knowing, that invisible carrying of permanent damage, is itself part of what makes the wound so difficult to heal. The reconstruction happened quickly by disaster standards. Infrastructure replaced, roads repaired, some towns rebuilt on higher ground, or in new locations deemed safer from future tsunamis. Within a decade, much of the physical damage from the earthquake and wave had been addressed, at least in areas where return was possible. where radiation hadn't made restoration pointless. New seawalls rose along the coast, taller than before, engineered to withstand waves that exceeded the 2011 tsunami. Concrete monuments to lessons learned expensively. Buildings went up. Schools and hospitals and community centres designed with updated codes that accounted for what the previous structures hadn't survived. The form of normalcy returned faster than anyone expected, evidence that Japan's capacity for rebuilding hadn't been erased by the disaster, that the systems for organising recovery and channeling resources to affected areas could still function even in the face of catastrophe. But form isn't substance, and rebuilding infrastructure doesn't rebuild the communities that gave that infrastructure meaning. The memory refused to align with the form. New buildings stood on sites where people had died, structures that looked forward while the communities they served kept looking back, unable to forget what had been lost, unable to occupy the rebuilt spaces without remembering what had occupied them before. Schools opened in new facilities, but enrollment was a fraction of what it had been. Families that evacuated having made lives elsewhere. Children who would have attended now attending different schools in cities where the disaster was history rather than lived experience. The form said recovery, the memory said displacement. And the gap between them was where the nation existed after Fukushima, physically rebuilt but psychologically fractured, going through the motions of normalcy while carrying knowledge that normalcy was conditional, temporary, vulnerable to forces that preparation couldn't fully protect against. The nation rebuilt in form because that's what nations do after disasters. But memory operates on different timescales, holds onto trauma longer than concrete takes to cure, resists the optimism required to call reconstruction complete. The truth about memory is that it's selective in ways that reconstruction can't be. Buildings get rebuilt or they don't. Decisions made and executed. Physical problems solved with engineering and funding. But memory chooses what to keep, what to let go, what to mark as significant enough to pass on to people who weren't there when it happened. And what memory kept from Fukushima wasn't the reconstruction success stories, wasn't the new seawalls or updated building codes or the communities that did manage to return. Memory kept the images of explosion, the maps of exclusion zones, the stories of people who lost everything to contamination rather than water. Memory kept the institutional failures, the revelations about hidden reports, the understanding that the disaster wasn't just natural, but enabled by human decisions that prioritized wrong things. The nation rebuilt in form, but memory built something else, a counter-narrative that persisted alongside the official story of recovery, reminding anyone who listened that what was rebuilt wasn't the same as what was lost. That form without trust is just architecture without community. The operation to reconcile form and memory was attempted through ceremonies, anniversaries marked with speeches that acknowledged loss while celebrating resilience, official narratives that tried to thread the line between honoring what happened and encouraging people to move forward. But you can't ceremony your way out of collective trauma. You can't speech away the knowledge that institutions failed, that warnings were ignored, that the catastrophe was both unprecedented and entirely predictable to people who'd been silenced or erased from decision-making. The rebuilt nation looked impressive from a distance, evidence that Japan could recover from anything, that disasters were temporary setbacks rather than permanent transformations. But up close, in conversations with people who'd been displaced or who'd stayed in contaminated areas by choice or necessity, the memory told different stories, personal rather than national, specific rather than general, resistant to the sanitized version that reconstruction projects implied. The nation rebuilt. But the people who comprised that nation carried memories that couldn't be rebuilt, experiences that couldn't be replaced with new infrastructure, trust that couldn't be restored with better engineering. The form stands now as evidence of what's possible when resources and political will align toward recovery, when a nation decides that reconstruction is imperative regardless of cost. New towns on safer ground, improved disaster warning systems, seawalls that dwarf their predecessors. The visible markers of lessons learned and applied, of preparation upgraded to meet threats that were previously underestimated. But memory persists in the spaces between buildings, in the empty lots where structures once stood but won't be rebuilt, in the exclusion zones where forms stopped mattering because no one could live there regardless of what was constructed. A nation rebuilt in form, but the memory remains incomplete, fractured, unable to be restored because memory isn't infrastructure. It's lived experience, collective trauma, understanding that changes how people see the world and can't be undone by showing them that the physical world has been repaired. The gap between form and memory is where Japan exists now, a decade after the disaster, rebuilt in ways that matter and unhealed in ways that matter more, carrying forward into a future that looks structurally sound but is built on foundations that memory knows are more fragile than the engineering suggests. The nation rebuilt, but it will never fully rebuild in memory because memory isn't forgetting, and what Fukushima revealed can't be hidden again behind new concrete and updated codes. The markers appeared across the affected regions, stone monuments etched with dates and wave heights, memorials to communities that no longer existed, or existed only in diminished forms. Some were placed at the inland limits of where the tsunami reached, stark reminders to future generations that water had come this far, that what seemed safely distant from the coast had once been underwater. Others marked sites where specific tragedies had occurred, schools where children had sheltered only to be overtaken, care facilities where the elderly couldn't evacuate quickly enough, places where individual human stories intersected with the larger catastrophe in ways that demanded recognition. The monuments were attempts to make memory permanent, to encode in stone what might otherwise fade as survivors aged, and direct experience became historical account. But stone doesn't carry the weight of lived experience. It marks, it commemorates, but it can't transmit understanding to people who weren't there, can't bridge the gap between knowing something happened and feeling the reality of what that meant. Some communities rebuilt, others didn't. The decision wasn't always about radiation or safety or technical assessments of risk. Sometimes it was about population, about whether enough people wanted to return to make rebuilding viable, whether the young would come back, or if recovery would mean a town of elderly residents growing older together until natural attrition finished what the disaster started. The rebuilt towns carried a strange quality. Streets that looked new but felt haunted. Spaces designed for populations larger than those occupying them. Infrastructure built for futures that might not materialize. The form was optimistic. The reality was uncertain. And the gap between them was evident in empty storefronts and schools with extra capacity, and the quiet that comes from places that used to be busier, used to have more children, used to have futures that felt inevitable rather than conditional. The truth these rebuilt communities embodied was uncomfortable. Reconstruction alone doesn't guarantee recovery. You can rebuild every structure, replace every piece of damaged infrastructure, engineer solutions to problems that the disaster exposed, and still end up with places that exist more on maps than in any meaningful social sense. Communities are people, not buildings. And when people disperse, when families make lives elsewhere, and children grow up in cities rather than returning to rebuilt towns on coasts that took everything once and might again, the reconstruction becomes almost archaeological, creating sites that future generations will study as evidence of what Japan attempted after Fukushima, but which didn't fully succeed, because success required more than engineering, required reversing demographic trends and restoring trust, and convincing people that return was possible not just physically but emotionally, psychologically, culturally. The operation to make memory permanent was always fighting against time and distance, against the natural process by which direct experience becomes second-hand account, becomes historical event, becomes footnote. The monuments helped. The museums that were built in some communities, preserving artifacts from before the disaster, showing footage and testimony, trying to educate visitors about what happened. But education isn't experience. Understanding intellectually that a disaster occurred doesn't create the visceral knowledge that comes from living through it, from losing people you loved, from having your entire life trajectory altered by events beyond your control. The gap between those who remember directly and those who only know the story will widen every year, eventually becoming a gap between generations, between those for whom Fukushima is personal history and those for whom it's national history, significant but not formative, something learned about rather than lived through. The nation rebuilt in form, creating visible markers of recovery that could be photographed and reported, evidence that Japan had overcome yet another disaster in its long history of overcoming disasters. But memory remained fragmented, incomplete, resistant to the official narratives that tried to contain it, that tried to balance acknowledgement of loss with celebration of resilience. Some communities carried the memory more heavily than others, differences based on proximity to the disaster, on whether people returned or stayed away, on how thoroughly the disaster had transformed daily life versus leaving it mostly intact. The nation wasn't unified in memory the way it was unified in reconstruction efforts. Memory was local, personal, specific to individuals and families and communities that had experienced different versions of the same catastrophe, depending on where they were and what they lost, and whether they had options or were trapped by circumstances. A nation rebuilt in form, but never fully in memory, because memory can't be rebuilt. It can only be carried, passed on incompletely to those who weren't there, preserved imperfectly in stone and museums, and the stories survivors choose to tell when asked about something most would rather forget, but know they shouldn't. The form stands as testament to recovery. The memory persists as testament to what was lost, what couldn't be recovered, what no amount of reconstruction could restore or replace. Both are true. Both are Japan after Fukushima. And the tension between them is permanent. The photographs from before became relics, images of streets and buildings and gatherings that showed a world that no longer existed in the same form, even when the physical structures had been restored. Families held onto these images with a reverence usually reserved for much older history. Albums showing children at festivals that would never be held again. Storefronts that had been rebuilt but under different ownership. Beaches that looked the same but felt different, marked by knowledge of what had happened there. The photographs were evidence that memory and form had diverged, that what could be seen wasn't the same as what was remembered, that rebuilding hadn't erased the gap between past and present, but had actually made it more visible by creating structures that looked similar but lacked the continuity that gave them meaning. The nation could rebuild buildings. It couldn't rebuild the unbroken chain of experience that had made those buildings more than just architecture, that had made them homes and gathering places and landmarks in personal geographies that the disaster had permanently altered. Some people returned to find their rebuilt homes technically superior to what had been lost, better engineered, more resistant to future disasters, equipped with the lessons learned from 2011. But technical superiority didn't translate to emotional comfort, to the sense of belonging that comes from living in spaces that carry history, that have absorbed decades of daily life and family memory. The new structures were clean, fresh, unmarked by time, and that unmarked quality made them feel temporary, transitional, as if they were placeholders for something more permanent that might come later, but hadn't yet. The form was complete. The memory had nowhere to attach, no physical evidence of the past to anchor itself to, no walls that had witnessed previous generations, no floors worn smooth by years of footsteps. Rebuilding had created a strange kind of loss, not the obvious loss of destruction, but the subtle loss of continuity, of connection to time that stretched backward further than the disaster. The truth that haunted reconstruction efforts was this: you can't rebuild time. You can rebuild structures in days or months or years, depending on scale and complexity. But time, the accumulated weight of years lived in places, of generations connected to specific locations, of traditions practiced continuously in the same spaces, that can't be reconstructed. It can only be restarted, beginning again from a point after interruption. And that interruption remains visible in memory, even when it's invisible in form. The rebuilt nation looked whole in aerial photographs, coastal communities rising again where they'd been swept away, urban centers restored where they'd been damaged. But the memory carried by individuals within those communities knew the wholeness was superficial, that beneath the reconstructed form was a rupture that couldn't be sealed, a before and after that couldn't be bridged with concrete and steel. The operation to integrate new structures into collective memory was ongoing, a process that would take decades, that required new experiences to accumulate in rebuilt spaces, new generations to grow up without direct memory of what came before, for whom the rebuilt form would be the only form they'd known. Children born after 2011 would eventually inhabit these spaces, without the burden of comparison, without the weight of knowing what had been lost. For them, the rebuilt nation would simply be the nation, form and memory aligned because their memory would begin after the reconstruction, would include the disaster only as history rather than lived experience. But for everyone who'd been there, who'd experienced the before and the after, the form would always carry the ghost of what it replaced, would always be in dialogue with memory that preserved a version of reality that no longer existed anywhere except in photographs and stories, and the persistent sense that something essential had been lost, even as something functional had been rebuilt. A nation rebuilt in form, but never fully in memory, because form exists in present tense while memory operates in past tense, and the two can never perfectly align when catastrophe has created a rupture between them. The buildings stand, the infrastructure functions. The coastline is occupied again, though not as densely, not with the same confidence, not without awareness of vulnerability that previous generations had been able to ignore, or had been told they could ignore, by institutions that proved wrong. The nation rebuilt because that's what nations do, because the alternative is surrender, is allowing disaster to define the future completely rather than merely marking it. But the memory remains incomplete, fractured, unable to be reconstructed, because memory isn't material. It's experience. An experience of loss can't be undone by building new things in the place where loss occurred. The form will last as long as concrete lasts, as long as maintenance continues, as long as people choose to live in places marked by what happened there. But the memory will persist longer, carried by those who were there, passed on imperfectly to those who weren't. becoming history that future generations will study while living in a nation whose form has been rebuilt, but whose memory of what was lost, what failed, what was revealed about institutional failures and acceptable risk and the price of optimism, that memory will remain as permanent as stone monuments and more pervasive, woven into how Japan understands itself and its relationship to technology, disaster, and the uncomfortable truth that preparation is never complete, and safety is always conditional, and catastrophe is always possible, despite every assurance otherwise. The nation rebuilt in form, the memory remains unfinished. And the gap between them is where Japan continues to exist, years after the disaster, recovered in ways that matter and wounded in ways that persist, carrying forward with one foot in the reconstructed present and one still planted in the memory of what was lost and can never be fully restored. They rebuilt the seawalls higher, rewrote the protocols, promised it wouldn't happen again. But promises are just words, and words don't hold back water. Somewhere, in a facility operating right now, there's a report being filed, a concern being noted, a risk being classified as acceptable. The math will look sound, the regulators will approve, and people will go on living in the shadow of infrastructure they've been assured is safe, because the alternative is admitting that safety was never guaranteed, only marketed. Fukushima didn't end on March 11th, 2011. It just revealed what was already true, what remains true in every place where technology meets human fallibility, and the gap between them gets filled with optimism instead of honesty. The ocean returned what it had taken, but the truth it exposed, that's still out there, hidden in the next disaster no one's preparing for.